The 80s. So during the 80s, we're going to see a lot of society starts having this fascination really with the lifestyle of the rich and the famous. In fact, a lot of the TV shows during this era are going to depict families from like the top 20% of society. It's going to be very much shows like Dallas, Dynasty, Knots Landing. We also get a lot of young urban professionals. They're known as yuppies basically during this time. And they're really going to define themselves by consumerism, but not just consumerism, elitist consumerism. So it's like rather than buying their clothes at Sears, they want to buy their clothes at, Neiman Marcus or Bloomingdale's. We even see like corporate executives become like heroes in the minds of people, such as Donald Trump makes himself a celebrity. I mean, he puts his name on, office towers, hotels, casino. And so this kind of mindset is going to mean that greed is all right. I should also mention there's going to be some new things like new forms of music taking place during this time period, like punk rock. This is like bands like Nirvana. And then you're starting to see the origination of hip hop, basically, and rap. And a lot of it's dealing with like personal power, but then like sex. And then there's a lot of times like social and political critiques with like dealing with social inequalities and deprivation and such. We also get during the 80s CNN, the cable news network. This is going to basically give TV viewers the first chance to watch news coverage 24 hours a day. So now you can basically, turn on your TV at any point and watch the news. This is going to spread eventually to other countries and other viewers and other cable networks and such. There's a whole lot more global reporting as well. But then from there, we start seeing even more specialty programs. So it's things like you get MTV with music television, and it's round the clock. It really, with these music videos, you get almost a new form of popular art, really, but also advertising. But then you get other kinds of nuanced channels. So it'd be things like Nickelodeon for kids, VH1 for baby boomers. So all of this means we're getting more specialized program. Plus, you get people beginning to explore the World Wide Web. You even have like niche markets for like magazines. So what this really means with all these specifics is you have this basically vast quantity of information that's a lot more accessible to people. We also see during the 80s that basically all of these like federal tax and budget changes have effects on the different parts of society, but it's going to affect the rich and the poor differently. The economic reality is that the rich are going to get richer during this time period. The top 5%, top 1%, they're going to see their privately held wealth grow during the 80s. But even though you have all these tax cuts, you actually end up getting increases in Social Security tax. And this is going to end up hitting low-income workers the hardest. So in fact, those who are in the bottom 20% of annual income households actually are going to end up paying higher taxes during this time period. Also, with all of the federal budget cuts, basically this puts a lot more pressure on American cities to absorb a lot of those cuts. And it's going to be even more difficult for them to do this, especially with a lot of jobs moving more and more often to the suburbs. The thing is, there were plenty of jobs and there were plenty of jobs openings, but a lot of the poor people in America couldn't get to the suburbs because there just wasn't public transportation necessarily linking them to these jobs. That combined with the whole deindustrialization, we're actually seeing the average wage rate fall. And in fact, we see more women are going into work not because they necessarily want to, but because they're forced to in order to make ends meet. And even with two incomes, you see more and more families can't afford to like buy their own house. So this is really when we start seeing Americans are no longer expected to surpass their parents' standard of living. We're also seeing corporate downsizing. Basically, with more automation replacing a lot of lower paying jobs, we're seeing actually an increase in like white collar jobs. This would be like clerical and office workers kinds of things. And once again, these are kind of a lot of times temporary jobs. And so people would shift from job to job to job, which mean that their wages could be kept lower. Plus, companies, as they combine and have takeovers and stuff, they could cut costs by trimming down on administrators or eliminating entire management or support staff. It's really during the 80s we start seeing that idea of staying with the same job your entire life becomes much more dubious. We're also seeing an increase in the poverty rate. The number of Americans living in poverty increases during the 80s. A lot of this is because their new jobs paid less money, and a lot of times they paid less than poverty level wages. Now, generally, rather than blaming low wages and everything, especially people in the higher parts of society tended to blame, men themselves for their low wages. Like, you must have a low education, or you must be abusing drugs, or just like sheer laziness. But this avoided the fact of reality where there just was limited economic opportunity. A lot of the big problem was the isolation of job seekers in poor neighborhoods not being able to get to the employment opportunities. We also see women really are not expected to earn as much as men. This is the wage gap. It is still something that you see all the way through modern America today. But at that point in time, women earned about 60% of what men earned. Now, the thing is, part of this can be explained with like measurable factors, like lack of education or lack of experience. That if a woman didn't necessarily go to college, then of course they're not necessarily going to get paid as much as a colleague who did go to college who is male. But we see while this like gap narrows in the 80s and the 90s and even through to today, and it's only like at 75% in 2003, a lot of this is because of like you're getting better educated women and everything. But even at that point, you have to look at it and go, in 2003, you're still having this wage gap, and yet in 2002, women actually made up 57% of the 4-year college degrees. So we've closed the gap on like education disparities, and yet the wage gap still remains. So we're seeing that women were just more likely to be poor. Plus, this combined with that America relies on private support for child rearing, meaning that children generally have a higher chance of living in poverty and being worse off in America than a lot of times their peers in more advanced nations. If you've ever looked at daycare prices, they are very expensive. We're also seeing homelessness really growing in America in the 80s. The thing is, cities had always had like transient laborers or derelict alcoholics, or even just those who are voluntarily homeless. There's been societies even today that have basically made it where it's almost impossible for someone to be homeless, and yet there always is a homeless population, partly because there are some individuals who choose to be homeless because they don't want the responsibility of like paying bills and things like that. So there's always going to be a very, 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 very small percent like that. And so we had seen homelessness before the 80s, but we're going to see homelessness really boom in the 80s. And a lot of this is because we get a new approach when it comes to the treatment of mentally ill people. In fact, you see the population in mental hospitals reduces from about 540,000 people in 1960 to only 140,000 people in 1980. And it's not because we found ways necessarily to help them. A lot of it was that we see the deinstitutionalization of these mental hospitals, and the idea was that the patients would receive, like community-based treatments, but most of the time they just ended up on the streets or in overnight shelters. And unfortunately, being in those positions, they could find new forms of like self-destructive behavior from like drug abuse specifically. And so we're seeing permanently homeless people's numbers growing, about like tripling during this time period. Looking at the 80s, how can you compare it to today? Name at least one similarity from then when compared to today.